The group of five friends, Emily, Sarah, Rachel, Mark, and Jason, had set out for a weekend getaway in a remote cabin, nestled deep in the mountains. The idea had seemed like the perfect escape, a retreat from their stressful city lives, an opportunity to reconnect with one another and to unwind in nature's embrace. The journey had been challenging, though, as heavy snowfall made the roads nearly impassable. Despite the rough conditions, they had persevered, their spirits high, and eventually arrived at the rustic wooden cabin just before nightfall. The moment they stepped inside, they felt a strange, almost welcoming warmth. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the interior of the cabin was cozy and inviting. A stone fireplace crackled and hissed in one corner, its flames casting a soft glow that danced across the antique furniture that filled the space. The cabin was old, likely decades if not centuries old, but it had an undeniable charm. The smell of pine and wood mingled with the scent of snow, and for a moment it seemed like the perfect setting for a peaceful weekend. But as they unpacked and settled in, something about the place felt off. A subtle feeling, a whisper of discomfort, brushed against their senses, but they dismissed it. It was just the unfamiliarity, they told themselves. It wasn't until Sarah noticed the strange symbols that a deeper unease began to settle in. As the group gathered around the fireplace, unpacking the food and preparing dinner, Sarah's eyes drifted upwards. Above the hearth, carved into the wooden beams, were markings unlike anything she'd seen before. The symbols were intricate, almost otherworldly, and they looked ancient, etched deeply into the wood as if they had been there for centuries. Some were geometric, others resembled strange runes or twisted flowing shapes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "Hey guys, look at this," Sarah called out, her voice tinged with unease. The others gathered around, their curiosity piqued. Mark, ever the skeptic, reached up to touch one of the carvings, but paused as his fingers hovered just above the wood. "Weird. These look old, like really old." Emily leaned closer. "What kind of symbols are these? They don't look like anything I've ever seen." Rachel frowned, peering at the symbols. "Could they be some kind of ancient writing or a warning?" she suggested, though she tried to sound lighthearted. "Maybe it's just some old superstition from the people who lived here before." The group laughed nervously, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep in. The storm outside was growing more intense, and the wind howled, rattling the windows of the cabin. Still, they continued with their dinner preparations. The chatter around the table seemed to help dispel the tension, but the symbols stayed in Sarah's mind, flickering in the corners of her thoughts. As they ate, Rachel, ever the storyteller, brought up an old legend she had read about the region. "I found something interesting earlier today. You know the local folklore. It's about a spirit that haunts these mountains, particularly during blizzards. People say that when the snow falls thick, the spirit comes down from the peaks and takes those who wander too far from safety." Jason scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "It's just a ghost story, Rachel. No need to get all spooky on us." "I'm sure it's just a local myth, like all the other ghost stories you hear about in these remote places." But Rachel didn't let up. "It's not just any ghost story. It's about a spirit that can't be seen, but it can hear your footsteps. It's said that the spirit walks the mountains during storms, searching for those who dare venture out in the snow. If you get too close to the edge of the forest, or if you wander too far from your shelter, the spirit will claim you." The rest of the group chuckled nervously, brushing it off as they continued their meal. But there was an underlying tension in the air, a sense that Rachel's story wasn't just a story, that there was something more to it. They tried to distract themselves with board games, mugs of hot chocolate, and casual conversation, but the unsettling feeling never quite left them. The warmth of the cabin couldn't seem to chase away the growing sense of dread that clung to them, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. As the night wore on, the wind outside seemed to grow louder, howling and rattling the walls of the cabin. It wasn't the wind, though, that unsettled Emily. It was the faint whispers. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the wind. But as the night went on, she realized she was hearing something distinct. The faint murmurs, almost like voices, seemed to float through the storm, coming from somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin. The whispers were unintelligible, carried on the wind in a language that none of them could understand. But the sound of them, their soft, persistent call, sent a chill down her spine. "Did anyone else hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others stopped, frozen. Jason, who had been teasing Rachel about her ghost story, turned to look at Emily, his expression faltering. I I think so. What was that?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaking. "It sounded like whispers." The group fell silent, listening. The cabin seemed too still. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but there was something more now. The air in the room had changed. It felt thicker, colder, almost as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees in an instant. Mark stood up abruptly, trying to shake off the growing anxiety. "It's just the wind. Let's not start imagining things. I'm sure it's nothing." But as he spoke, the air around them seemed to shift. A gust of wind slammed the door to the cabin shut with a violent crash. The windows rattled, and the light from the fireplace flickered. Everyone jumped, their hearts racing. They rushed to the door, but as Jason grabbed the handle, he found that it wouldn't budge. The door, despite the force of the wind outside, was sealed shut, as if locked from within. Guys?" "The door's stuck," Jason said, his voice rising with panic. "It won't open." "What do you mean it won't open?" Mark asked, his voice shaky as he moved to join Jason by the door. "Try harder." The group scrambled to the door, but it refused to budge. It was as though the wood had melded to the frame, holding them in. They pulled and tugged, but there was no give. Panic set in. "This is insane," Sarah whispered. "We can't get out." Rachel, who had been standing near the fireplace, turned pale. "It's not just the door. It's the whole cabin. It feels wrong. Like something's changed." The whispers outside grew louder, their tones shifting from faint murmurs to something more deliberate, more ominous. They seemed to be coming from within the cabin now, echoing in the shadows. Then from the depths of the room, they heard it. A voice, low and guttural, like it was coming from the very foundation of the cabin. It seemed to rise from the fireplace itself. "Leave now." The group froze, their blood running cold. The voice was ancient, heavy with an unearthly malice. It seemed to seep through the very air, making the walls of the cabin feel as though they were closing in. Mark staggered back, his face drained of color. Did anyone else hear that?" Emily's voice was barely audible. "I heard it. I, I think we're not alone." The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, becoming more frantic. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. Footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the cabin, approaching them. "Who's there?" Jason shouted, his voice breaking. "Who's messing with us?" But there was no answer, only the sound of footsteps, closer now, almost at their backs. The group turned in horror, knowing that whatever it wasn't human. The door was still locked. The snowstorm outside raged on, and the spirit Rachel had warned them about had found them. They were trapped. The storm had intensified as the night dragged on. The snow, thick and unrelenting, pelted the cabin windows, its icy fingers seeming to creep inside through the smallest cracks. The wind screamed through the forest, its voice a low, mournful wail that carried an eerie sense of foreboding. Outside, the world was swallowed by the swirling whiteness, nothing visible beyond the thick curtain of snow. Inside the cabin, Jason, the group's resident skeptic, tried to laugh off the growing tension. "It's just a storm," he said with a half-hearted chuckle, trying to convince both himself and the others that it was nothing more than nature throwing a temper tantrum. His hands, however, fumbled nervously with a beer can, betraying the unease he refused to acknowledge aloud. But Rachel wasn't buying it. She sat stiffly in her seat, eyes scanning the darkened windows, as though she were waiting for something to appear at any moment. She felt it. There was something out there. Something she couldn't explain, but it was there, watching. She had seen it before, just a glimpse, a shadow flitting past the window, darker than the night itself. She had shaken her head, hoping it was nothing, but the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. What if it wasn't just the storm? What if it wasn't just the wind? Did you see that? Rachel whispered, her voice tight as she leaned toward Mark, who was closest to the window. Mark, always the more level-headed one, frowned and glanced out into the blackness. The wind howled, and the snow made everything seem like a blur. See what? There's nothing out there, he said, his tone firm but tinged with uncertainty. He wanted to reassure her, but deep down the feeling of dread gnawed at him too. It was just a storm. It had to be. But Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide. No, Mark. Something's out there. I swear, I saw a figure, dark, moving through the snow, just standing there like it was waiting. Rachel, it's probably just the wind, Jason said, his voice dismissive, but his eyes darted to the window nervously. He wasn't sure he believed in ghosts or monsters or anything that couldn't be explained by logic, but the weight in the air was undeniable. There was something about the night, something about the storm, that made everything feel off. Emily, who had been silently listening to the exchange, shivered and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. I heard something too, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A scratching sound coming from the door. I thought it was a branch or something, but I don't know anymore. It felt wrong. Jason scoffed and waved a hand. It's probably just a tree branch banging against the door. It's been a hell of a storm. Let's not jump to conclusions. But even he wasn't entirely sure. The sounds that had echoed through the cabin were strange, unfamiliar. And now, with Rachel insisting that she had seen something, the tension was thickening in the air, wrapping around them like a cold, invisible fog. As the wind outside howled louder, rattling the cabin's wooden frame, the group tried to settle back into some semblance of normalcy. But then the door suddenly jolted with a deafening bang. The noise reverberated through the cabin, sending a shock of panic through everyone. Mark jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice sharp, though there was a trace of uncertainty in it now. He rushed to the door, flashlight in hand, trying to steady his breathing. The others followed, each of them caught between fear and curiosity. Outside, the world was blanketed in a thick, oppressive white. The flashlight beam sliced through the snowstorm but revealed nothing. Nothing but swirling snow and dark shadows. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of the chaos. But then, just as he was about to turn away, his flashlight caught something. Something that made his blood run cold. There, in the deep snow, were footprints, deep, wide, and unmistakable. Mark's eyes locked on the tracks, his stomach tightening in dread. They were too large to be human, too unnatural to be from any animal he could think of. They looked like they were carved into the snow, as though something massive had stepped through the storm, its footprints marking the earth with a terrible, purposeful weight. The others crowded around, staring at the tracks in silence. Rachel's eyes were wide, her breath shallow. What the hell are those? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Mark, trying to remain rational, knelt down to inspect them. They were unmistakably huge, much too big for a bear or any animal he had ever seen. I don't know, he muttered, his voice strained. But those aren't human. A chill ran through the group. The storm had trapped them here, and now the storm seemed to be hiding something more sinister, something that was out there, waiting. We need to leave, Rachel insisted, her voice shaking. The morning came, but it brought with it no relief from the horror the group had experienced the night before. They awoke to an unsettling stillness in the cabin. The storm had subsided, but the landscape outside was a desolate, frozen expanse of white. Snow had piled high against the cabin, burying it in a thick blanket that seemed to swallow everything whole. The road leading to the cabin was completely obscured by drifts, and the car, which had once been their lifeline to the outside world, was now utterly buried. The snowstorm had done its job, trapping them in the mountain's cold embrace, far from any sign of civilization. For a brief moment, there was an illusion of calm, a quiet, almost peaceful scene outside the cabin windows. But it didn't take long for the realization to set in. They were stranded, completely isolated. The car was gone, the road impassable, and their only source of escape now cut off by a wall of snow. The group's panic began to grow as they processed the gravity of their situation. Rachel was the first to try and reach out for help. She pulled her phone from her pocket, but when she checked it, The screen displayed no signal, no bars, no connection, nothing. She tried again, shaking it as though it would somehow revive the dead signal, but the result was the same. "There's no signal," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "We're completely cut off." Jason, trying to keep a level head, pulled out his own phone to double-check, but it was clear they were all facing the same fate. No signal, no help. The phones were useless, just like their hopes of an easy escape. "Great," Jason muttered bitterly, throwing his phone onto the table. "We're stuck here, and it's not like we can just wait around for the storm to clear up. Look at this place. We're not going anywhere anytime soon." Mark and Sarah exchanged looks, but neither knew what to say. The overwhelming fear they had all felt the night before lingered like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every thought and every movement. The storm had passed, but the cabin felt colder now, emptier, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for something to happen. "We need to make sure we have enough food and supplies," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We can't just sit here and do nothing." The group set about searching the cabin for whatever they could find. They scoured the kitchen, the pantry, and any closets they could find, but the supplies were scarce. The only food they could find was a few cans of beans, some dried pasta, and a handful of crackers. Hardly enough to sustain them for more than a couple of days. In the back of a drawer in the kitchen, Rachel found something that made her pause. It was a small, tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. It looked old, much older than the cabin itself, and its leather cover was cracked and worn, as if it had been handled and passed around by many hands over the years. "Hey, look what I found," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly as she held it up. Mark walked over and took the journal from her, a puzzled look on his face. "What is it?" he asked, flipping it open. The handwriting was small and neat, but it was clear that the ink had faded over time. The first few pages had been yellowed and crinkled, but Mark could still make out the words. He began to read aloud, his voice steady at first, though it began to falter as he absorbed the contents of the journal. March 17th, 1947. The storm has come again. The winds howl and scream through the trees, and the snow falls relentlessly, burying the world beneath its weight. I hear whispers at night. They come from the forest, carried on the wind. I know I should not listen, but it calls to me. It is not human, not entirely. I can feel it, watching me, waiting. Mark paused, glancing up at the group, his eyes wide with concern. The tension in the room thickened as he read on, the words sinking into their minds. March 20th, 1947. It came again tonight. I saw it this time. Its form was shadowed, obscured by the snowstorm, but its eyes were like pits of darkness. It is not a man, nor a beast, but something older, something ancient. It feeds on fear. It draws you in with whispers, and once you hear them, you are lost. The storm is growing stronger. I fear I may not survive this night. If anyone finds this journal, if anyone reads these words, do not come here. The being in the snow will take you too. It is waiting. It is always waiting. There was a long pause as the weight of the words settled over the group. The journal had been written by someone named Elias Blackwood, a man who had lived in the cabin long before they had arrived. But now, as they read his final entry, the eerie similarities to their own situation became undeniable. The storm, the whispers, the thing that lurked just outside the cabin, hidden in the snow and darkness. What is this?" Rachel whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "What happened to Elias? What was that thing?" Mark set the journal down slowly, his hands shaking. "This is insane. It's just some old man's ramblings. He was probably just delirious from the storm." But Sarah, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, shook her head. "No, no, I don't think it's just a story. I think it's real." The others looked at her, disbelief and fear battling in their eyes. Rachel nodded, her own skin crawling as the memories of the night before, the whispers, the footsteps, the strange feeling of being watched, flooded back into her mind. "I don't know what it is," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "But whatever Elias was talking about, I think it's here." The air in the cabin grew heavy, as though something was pressing down on them. The wind outside began to pick up again, howling and moaning, But it felt different this time, almost as if it were alive, as if the storm itself were listening to their conversation, aware of their fear. Jason scoffed, trying to push the fear down. It's just some weird coincidence, okay? No way that whatever is out there is some monster. It's all just stories and old man ramblings. But before anyone could respond, something happened that turned their unease into pure terror. Emily, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, her eyes lost in thought, suddenly disappeared without a trace. It wasn't like she had left of her own accord. No one had seen her move, and yet, when the others turned to check on her, she was gone. The door to the cabin had been left wide open, the wind blowing in, swirling snow into the room. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable sense of something wrong. The group leapt to their feet, shouting Emily's name, but there was no answer. Only the sound of the wind and the eerie quiet of the cabin, which seemed to deepen with each passing moment. Outside, the snow-covered forest loomed like a dark, desolate wilderness, the trees shrouded in mist and snow. Emily's footprints, small and hurried, led from the cabin door toward the woods. But as the group rushed to the door and looked out into the storm, the footprints disappeared abruptly, vanished into thin air, as if Emily had been lifted off the ground and carried away. Panic set in, and the group began shouting her name, but there was no answer, only the wind and the deep, unsettling silence that followed. Fear gripped the remaining four as they scrambled to barricade themselves inside, the realization sinking in that something, or someone, was toying with them. Whatever had taken Emily was not done. It was still out there, in the storm, waiting for the next moment of weakness. Then hours later the scream came. It was a blood-curdling shriek, full of terror and anguish. Yet it didn't sound human. It was twisted, distorted, as though Emily's voice had been warped, dragged through 1,000 layers of icy fear. The sound cut through the blizzard, echoing in the night. And it was then that they knew. The thing in the snow, whatever it was playing with them. The whispers, the footsteps, the screams. It wasn't hunting them. It was tormenting them, drawing them deeper into the storm. They huddled together, knowing that morning may never come. Desperation and dread weighed heavily on the air as Mark and Jason stood in the middle of the storm-ravaged cabin, their minds and hearts in turmoil. The violent blizzard raged outside, its howling winds and relentless snow blurring the world beyond their small refuge. Emily had disappeared, leaving nothing but a trail of footprints that had vanished into the storm. The terror of the previous night seemed to have gained an even darker intensity, and despite Sarah and Rachel's desperate protests, Mark and Jason made up their minds. They would go after Emily. The words "will be quick" hung in the air, fragile and unconvincing. Mark had no illusions about the danger they were walking into. They both understood the risks, venturing into the blizzard, following a trail that had already disappeared, and facing whatever lurked in the snow. But the thought of Emily, alone and possibly in peril, was enough to drive them forward. The icy grip of fear was relentless, but it was a different kind of fear that spurred them on, one that demanded they take action, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of whatever nightmare had descended upon them. "We'll be back soon. You'll be okay here," Mark told Sarah and Rachel, though his voice faltered. Even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. He wasn't sure they'd be okay. In fact, a part of him doubted he'd ever return. But the need to do something, to search for Emily, to attempt to undo whatever had been set in motion, was overpowering. Rachel tried to stop them, her face pale with dread. "Don't go," she begged, her voice trembling with fear. "Please, it's too dangerous. We can't just go out there." But Mark and Jason were already pulling on their thick jackets and grabbing whatever gear they could find. Without another word, they stepped out into the blizzard, leaving the warmth and safety of the cabin behind. The door slammed shut behind them with a finality that echoed in their minds, a grim reminder of the isolation they now faced. The moment they stepped outside, the storm hit them with full force. The wind was brutal, cutting through their clothes like daggers of ice. Every breath felt like inhaling needles, and the snowflakes stung their skin, blurring their vision. The world outside was a swirling mass of white. The trees that had once stood tall now hunched under the weight of the snow, their branches twisted and bent. It was as if the forest itself had turned against them, as if the very land was conspiring to keep them trapped here, in the storm's merciless grip. They trudged forward, moving as best as they could, despite the snow piling up around their boots. The trail of footprints that Emily had left behind was faint, nearly erased by the blinding wind and heavy snowfall, but it was the only lead they had. So they pressed on, fighting through the biting cold, knowing that each step further into the woods brought them closer to an unknown fate. As they moved deeper into the forest, the ominous feeling of being watched crept over them like a shadow. The trees seemed to close in around them, their skeletal branches groaning in the wind, creating eerie sounds that only heightened the sense of dread. The storm, once just a chaotic force of nature, now felt like something far more sinister, alive, sentient, and hungry. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense became that they were not alone. It wasn't just the wind howling, it was as if the woods themselves were whispering, watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. The trail, faint as it was, continued to lead them through the dense forest, but the snow fell thicker, obscuring any trace of Emily's passage. The cold began to feel like a living entity, gnawing at their skin, freezing their breath in the air, making each step harder than the last. But they couldn't turn back. Not now. They had to find her, or at least understand what had happened. The stakes felt impossibly high, and their fear was growing with each passing minute, consuming them. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through the blizzard, of battling against the storm, they finally found her, or rather, what was left of her. The sight that greeted them was something neither of them would ever forget. Emily's body lay twisted in the snow, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, frozen in a grotesque parody of life. She was far from the vibrant, energetic person they had known. The terror that had claimed her in her final moments was still visible, frozen in her wide, unblinking eyes. Her mouth hung slightly open, frozen as though she had been screaming, but no sound had come from her. The expression on her face was a look of pure horror, as if she had witnessed something so terrible that even death couldn't erase it. But it wasn't just the twisted, frozen body that sent a chill through their veins. It was what had been done to her. As Mark and Jason approached, the snow beneath their feet crunched loudly in the silence, and they noticed the strange symbols carved into Emily's arms. The cuts were deep and jagged, as if made by some ritualistic blade, and the shapes of the symbols were unnervingly familiar. The same strange carvings that had appeared on the wooden beams above the fireplace in the cabin were now etched into Emily's skin. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The symbols weren't just random markings. They were part of something much darker, a warning, a seal, perhaps even a curse. The very thing they had brushed off as mere superstition was now a terrifying reality. The storm, the blizzard, and whatever dark entity had claimed the land were not just stories. They were real, and they were hunting them. A sense of panic exploded inside Mark. He wanted to scream, to run back to the cabin, to leave this place behind forever. But the weight of what they had found, the twisted corpse of their friend, held them in place. There was no escaping it now. "We have to go back," Jason muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling with fear. "We can't stay here. We need to get back to the cabin now." But as they turned to leave, a horrible realization stopped them in their tracks. They weren't alone. The wind, which had been howling through the trees, grew deafening, almost as if the very air around them was alive. The snowflakes, each one distinct and individual, began to swirl more erratically, twirling in spirals, and that was when they heard it. The whispers, faint at first but growing louder, almost as if the wind itself were speaking. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice. It was calling to them. It was then that their worst nightmare began to unfold. They ran, the urgency in their every movement, but as they reached the edge of the forest, their hearts froze. The cabin was no longer where it had been. The door that had once been shut tight was now ajar. The soft wails from within the cabin reached their ears, a symphony of sorrow and terror. They were too late. Something had already claimed Rachel. The two men stumbled back, desperate to get away, but their minds were reeling with the weight of what had just occurred. The symbols, the body, the whispers. The entity had been set free, and it was no longer just a threat. It had become a predator, hunting them one by one. When they returned to the cabin, Sarah was holding the journal in her hands, her face pale and haunted. She had discovered the horrifying truth that had eluded them all. Elias Blackwood had once lived here, and in his desperation to survive, he had carved the same symbols in an attempt to ward off an ancient entity, a being that thrived on fear. But his ritual had failed. The entity had broken free, and now it was feeding on them. It didn't just kill, it absorbed its victims, turning them into part of the storm itself. The very snowflakes that fell from the sky were not just frozen water, they were the voices of the dead, calling out for more victims, luring them into the cursed blizzard. They were trapped, caught in a nightmare that refused to end. The storm and whatever horror it had unleashed was not just something they could run from. It had become part of them. The whispers were all around, and with every breath they took, they could feel the presence of the dead, the souls of the lost, now part of the endless storm. The entity was watching, waiting for the next to fall. The final night had arrived. The wind howled through the skeletal trees like a chorus of tormented souls, and the storm raged with an unrelenting fury. The old cabin trembled under the relentless force of nature, its wooden beams creaking and groaning, as though they too feared what lurked in the storm. Only Sarah, Mark, and Jason remained now. The others were gone, swallowed by the entity that had been hunting them since the first night. Then it revealed itself. An emaciated figure, its body encrusted with layers of ice, emerged from the blizzard. Its hollow eyes gleamed like dark voids, empty yet filled with an insatiable hunger. Long, jagged claws protruded from its skeletal fingers, glistening with frost, eager to tear into flesh. It did not move like something of this world. Instead, it flickered in and out of existence, shifting unnaturally through the storm as if the very laws of reality bent to its will. The moment they glimpsed it fully, a guttural wail filled the air, a soul-rending scream that did not come from the creature itself, but from somewhere beyond, a place of unrelenting darkness. Rachel's screams echoed through the night, but only for a moment. Then there was silence. Sarah clutched Elias's tattered journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its brittle pages. The words were smudged, the ink faded, but she had memorized what she needed. There was only one way to stop the entity, a ritual of fire and salt, a desperate attempt to seal it away before they all met the same fate as their friends. Mark held the lantern, its small flame barely flickering against the howling wind, and Jason poured the salt in a desperate, erratic circle around them. They had to act quickly, but the entity had no intention of letting them finish. Jason gasped as something yanked him backward, his feet leaving the ground as if unseen hands had seized him. His terrified eyes met Sarah's for a fleeting second before the blizzard swallowed him whole. His screams, distorted and inhuman, faded into the wind. He was gone. Sarah stifled a sob, her heart pounding. There was no time to grieve. Only she and Mark remained, and the entity was closing in. The walls of the cabin groaned, shadows stretching unnaturally across the room, twisting into shapes that clawed at the edges of their vision. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the temperature plummeting to a bone-chilling cold. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We have to finish it, now." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to focus. She knelt beside the symbols carved into the wooden beam, tracing them with trembling fingers. With the last of the kerosene, she doused the carvings and struck a match. The flame hesitated for a second, as though even fire feared what was coming, But then it roared to life. The symbols ignited, glowing an eerie crimson before erupting into a blinding blaze. The entity shrieked. The entire cabin shuddered, the force of the sound shaking the walls. Sarah and Mark barely had time to throw themselves to the floor as a shock wave rippled outward, shattering windows and sending shards of ice flying like daggers. The fire consumed the carvings, and for a brief moment, the entity seemed to falter, its form distorting as if caught between worlds. Then, with one final piercing wail, it was gone. Silence fell. The storm had ceased. The howling wind was no more, replaced by an eerie stillness. Snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground outside. The once violent blizzard now nothing more than a gentle snowfall. The cabin stood, battered and broken, yet somehow still standing. Mark and Sarah lay on the cold wooden floor, gasping for breath, their bodies bruised and exhausted. Slowly they forced themselves to their feet. Their hands were scraped, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. But they were alive. Without a word, they stepped outside. The sky was a deep, endless black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Their boots crunched against the fresh snow as they stumbled toward the main road. Each step felt heavier than the last, their limbs drained of all strength. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get as far away from the cursed place as possible. Then headlights. A rescue team, bundled in heavy coats and carrying flashlights, rushed toward them. Voices, distant and muffled, called out, assuring them that they were safe now. Sarah barely registered their words. Someone draped a warm blanket over her shoulders. Another led Mark toward an ambulance. They were alive. They had survived. But something felt wrong. As Sarah turned back one last time, her breath hitched. Through the shattered window of the cabin, she saw it. The entity stood there motionless, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. It did not move. It did not attack. It only watched. A shiver ran down her spine. No one else seemed to notice. The rescuers spoke in hushed tones, leading them away, promising warmth. It wasn't over. The entity was still there, waiting. It had merely been weakened, not destroyed. And when the next storm came, when the next unfortunate souls found themselves trapped in that cursed place, it would return. It always did. As the rescue team led them away, Sarah whispered under her breath, a vow more to herself than anyone else. We should have burned it down. The wind picked up again, ever so slightly, as if in response. And in the depths of the cabin's broken window, the hollow eyes never blinked.